Let's talk about covenants. If you've been part of the believing community for any real length of time, you've probably heard that word used repeatedly. We even call the divisions of our Bibles the Old and New Testament, which is just the Latin word for covenant. Basically, covenant is just a fancy way of saying an agreement between two parties to have a special relationship. Entire theologies are based around covenants found in the Bible, and yet for many people, the idea is still very confusing. And this isn't helped by the fact that scholars can't agree on how many covenants there are in the Bible. Even the contracts that everyone can agree on can seem very confusing. Abraham gets a different deal than Noah does. Moses gets all sorts of new laws that Jesus claims to both fulfill and dismiss. Looking through a 21st century lens, it can all seem very disjointed and confusing, but at the time, it wasn't. Covenants are whatever is necessary to define and support a relationship and make sure that both parties keep the agreement that they have reached. And all of the covenants in the Bible fit both what were common practices of that day and age and flow in a progression that is very natural for the relationship between God and God's people becoming more distant and more strained. Speaking with broad brushstrokes, the Bible is primarily about describing that relationship, what the people see God doing and wanting, what the people themselves are doing, and then what God thinks about that. And the primary way for the people to understand that relationship is through the series of covenants that God established with them. The different agreements that God reaches with his people are different because the relationships were different at the time. And covenants vary situation to situation, from the very informal between people who know each other well to the incredibly detailed and complex peace treaties between empires. But a good covenant always fits the relationship that it is being applied to. For instance, I don't need to define very much when it comes to a relationship between me and my best friends. I just know that I can call on them and they'll be there. And if they call on me, I'll be there for them. But suppose I'm working with a friend and they fail to come through on a few things. Next time I need them, I'll probably send them a reminder text and email, or maybe have a conversation with them to remind them of what they promised to help me with. If they still keep falling short, maybe a simple contract might be in order, like so many people did with their college roommates. A short statement that outlines exactly what needs to be done. Finally, if they kept falling short, I might have to resort to legal action, creating an ironclad contract that stipulates exactly what is expected of the person and what the consequences will be if they fail to meet those expectations. That person might still be my friend, but there would be a gaping hole in our relationship where they continued to let me down, where they continued to break their word and forget about what we had agreed that they would do. Now imagine that if they did shape up, but instead of focusing on our relationship, they started focusing on meeting the exact requirements of our agreement. At that point, I'd have a decision to make, right? I could either tear up the contract and focus on my friendship, or I could let the rules stand at the sacrifice of my relationship with that person. That's a fairly natural progression of relational agreements, right? Well, that is also basically the history of biblical covenants between God and God's people. At creation, Adam and Eve walked with God, talked with God. There was obviously a deep relationship there, but not one that needed to be formalized. They just acted in each other's best interests, and that was enough. There were restrictions, but nothing formal, just a simple, hey, stay away from that tree, okay? But they failed God spectacularly, creating a hole in that relationship with God that kept getting bigger and bigger until God eventually nearly wiped out all of humanity with a flood. Noah's family was saved, but a new covenant, a new agreement had to be made because Noah's family didn't walk with God like Adam and Eve did. They didn't know God in the same sort of a way. So a few more provisions were given, and a periodic reminder of that agreement was given to them as well in the form of a rainbow. Something that would hopefully help them remember their agreement with God better. When that again failed and humanity kept making the same mistakes, getting ever more distant from God and ever larger, God revised his previous agreement with the next righteous person that he met, Abram. But this time around, humanity had fallen far enough away from God that the agreement had to be a much more formal arrangement.
Abram got a new name,
Abraham, and circumcision was added as a constant sign of the covenant with God, something that the people couldn't get away from. Also, both more promises of blessing and restrictions on Abraham's behavior were put in place. Humanity had proven to need more guidance, and so a more formal agreement was signed, something that would hopefully keep them in line and help them remember it better. The way this treaty was signed, however, seems barbaric at worst, outlandish at best by today's standards. Abraham took a series of animals, killed them, cut them in two, and laid them out so that someone could walk between them. This wasn't random, though. This was normal. The promises made in a fairly serious covenant agreement like this one were enforced by promises before a person's God and by fear. So to really drive home the point of how seriously they should take their promises, people would divide up animals and then walk between them, saying, if I break this agreement, let what was done to these animals be done to me. To Abraham, this symbol would have been normal. But what wasn't normal was that he was not required to walk through them. Instead, God symbolically walks between the animals twice, taking both his place and Abraham. God already knew the agreement would be broken and was preparing the way to pay the price for it himself. And indeed, Abraham's descendants' relationship with God did deteriorate to the point where they couldn't recognize which God was speaking to them. And this complete lack of knowledge about God and what God wanted meant that an even more structured, more formal covenant would be needed in order to point people in the right direction and keep them walking towards God. And this new covenant was given to Moses in the form of the law. Summarized in the Ten Commandments, this law is dense, thick, full of rules, and really very strange seeming to many people reading it today. The practice of writing it down on 2 tablets in particular seems like a really arbitrary requirement that God had of Moses. But all of this followed what was standard procedure in relationships between nations of that day and age. If a less formal covenant failed, then a more formal, more rigorous one would be brought up and enforced. We have surviving examples of the sort of treaty that God made with the Israelites from both the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the Hittite Empire. And they mirror the law that was given to Moses in a number of ways. First, a covenant treaty would begin with a preamble, where it sets out just who the parties involved are, and often it provides a brief description of what was the purpose for that contract. Now, this often included long lists of the gods on both sides who were witnesses to the agreement. Because without international law, only the gods could hold the nations accountable for what they had promised to each other. Next comes the terms of the agreement themselves. Now, this is not a one-sided affair, but are the written guidelines for the relationship of those two parties, that you do this, I will give that, and we will both be happy. That sort of thing. For a longer treaty, it would usually be the highlights first and then the details afterwards. Much like the Ten Commandments given first and then fleshed out in later chapters and books. These highlights of the covenant agreement would then be copied out and written identically on 2 different stone tablets. These tablets would then be taken and placed in the most sacred spot for each of the 2 parties involved in the agreement. These were to be reminders to the people of what they had agreed to. What is striking is not that God had Moses make 2 tablets. What is striking is that Moses got to keep both of them, because the most meaningful location in the entire world for God was in the center of his people. Next would be a reminder to keep the stipulations of the contract, not to change anything, and always, always, always obey them. This command is backed up with a reminder usually that the gods are watching, because that really is the centerpiece of enforcement of these treaties, that if you break them, the gods will not be happy. The Bible is noteworthy simply because there's only one God involved, and that God is participating in the writing of this agreement and not just witnessing it. What normally followed would be an extensive list of all of the curses that someone could expect if they broke the treaty. Now, this was the insurance policy, the stick to go with the carrot. In the Assyrian treaty, used here as comparison with the Bible, there are 70 different curses mentioned. About 2/3 of the entire thing are lists of curses if you break the agreement. Comparatively, the covenant with Moses barely includes curses at all. But the similarities between these two covenants are still striking, to say the least. This was the common format of the time. And it only seems unusual to us because we are not from that culture and time period. Sadly, even this covenant didn't keep the people on track. And soon after, they asked for a formal mediator between them and God in the form of a king. God agreed and eventually ratified the original treaty with Moses through his mediator, King David. But not even that worked. By the Roman era, after many failures at paying any attention to the covenant whatsoever, many people were paying exacting attention to the details of God's agreement with Moses. But they were missing that that agreement was meant to be the foundation for a good relationship between God and God's people. Fortunately, if all other forms of covenant agreement failed, there was still one thing that the parties could do to escalate and solidify that agreement, to make sure that it was as unbreakable as it possibly could be. If you really wanted to solidify a relationship with a people and nothing else was working, then a state marriage was the option of last resort and the best way to go. Nothing solidified an agreement like a marriage. Something that royalty for thousands of years have known and implemented. The New Testament is filled with marriage language. Jesus' second coming is described in very relational marital terms, that Jesus is coming to claim his bride, who he will then bring with him back to heaven to live with God the Father. A new covenant that once again attempts to reforge the bonds of relationship between God and God's people that had fallen apart over the centuries. This time using a marriage. None of the covenants we have in the Bible appeared out of thin air. They're the natural progression of a relationship that is becoming more and more strained, expressed through the language and culture of that era. They aren't random. And for me at least, the context of covenants being the normal way of defining and strengthening special relationships in that era is very helpful for me as I read the rest of Scripture. It makes a lot of things fall into place that otherwise just seem a little random. As always, thank you for watching. Hope you have a great day. See you next video.